Right, there are a number of important governance issues that we addressed during implementation. And the first one is who can see the GP record? And GPs, as Caldecott guardians of their patients' data, are very rightly concerned that that is limited to people who are working within the clinical team for the patient. And so it's incredibly important to have record sharing agreements that have the right constraints on who can see the record, role-based access, and aspects like that. So that needs to be sorted out. And actually, getting sharing agreements between practices and the Royal London was not a problem, because as the Clinical Effectiveness Group, we've negotiated this kind of thing before, and people trusted us to do it effectively. The other important aspect of governance was around informed patient consent for sharing their record. And I think what was really interesting about this is that for most patients, they think this is happening anyway, and they're surprised that it isn't. And as yet, we haven't had a single patient who has refused access to the shared record.
So I would say it was really important for us to work closely with the information governance team, and instead of taking the issue to them as though it was, a tick box exercise or something for them just to sign off and allow us to get on with things, we actually found it was really important to involve them in the process and have a sort of an active discussion about it, rather than it just kind of trying to tick the box on governance, if you see what I mean. So yeah, it was important for us to engage the information governance team actively, rather than kind of taking a sort of reactive approach. So there are a series of kind of formal information governance steps that we needed to go through. So we filled out, data privacy impact assessments to ensure that the technology and the service change were appropriate. But it was also really important for us to make sure that the information governance team were sort of a part of the process, because when we first started this work, we were kind of working in unprecedented territory slightly, and so it was important for them to kind of have an open discussion with us about what some of the risks were and what acceptable mitigations for those risks were, and how we might kind of address those challenges within the project.
I think it hasn't, IT and the changing of the way set up services hasn't really changed the responsibilities. So I think we're still quite clear that out in the community, the GP has responsibility within the trusts, the clinicians there. When you're setting up services in between the two, then you have to define who that responsibility sits with to a certain degree. But again, it comes back to, if you look at the way the data flows, it's who's responsible for putting what data in. And that kind of guides you as to who's responsible for that care. But the data aspect of it doesn't change the fact that if you've got a GP and a consultant caring for a patient prior to using technology and setting up new systems, you've always had that responsibility. It's always needed to be defined. And I don't think that's changed. I think, if anything, these new systems that we're setting up actually give us a chance to clarify whose responsibility it is. So, it's... in one way, it's evolving quite quickly. In another way, it's actually just building on established processes that we've already got.
We were quite clear that the responsibility would lie with us, and we would implement any actions decided upon at the virtual clinic. The only issue would be where we asked the GP to start a new medication. Obviously, we would write to the GP and say, we have discussed this is the rationale, please could you start or change this, whatever medication it was. But no, we hold clinical responsibility, and we follow up the patients virtually as well. So no, the responsibility lies with us, and we were quite clear about that.
I think one of the interesting things that has emerged, and quite a lot of these governance issues are emergent problems, they come out during the course of implementation, is the question of who has responsibility for the patient in these virtual clinics. And certainly when we started, we made the assumption that the GP would retain the responsibility for the patient, and indeed that the experience of virtual clinics would be upskilling GPs so that they'd be able to manage CKD more effectively. In fact, this approach was challenged by one CCG. They were suggesting that the nephrologist should take responsibility, clinical responsibility for all these patients. But this had a rapid pushback from the nephrology service, who I think quite rightly said that was completely impractical. And I believe that in essence, our model is an extreme version of the advice and guidance lines that are available in a number of services. I say extreme because, of course, the nephrologist has access to the complete GP record rather than just a sort of hasty email. And it seems to me that if you haven't actually seen the patient face-to-face and you're just giving advice and guidance, it seems right that responsibility should remain with the GP. But this is something that's a slightly grey area, and I think it's something that needs to be discussed in some detail further on, and possibly needs to go into the SLA for these kind of services.